Okay, this next part is of paramount importance. Not that everything else isn't important, but this really distinguishes between those who grasp Butler's reading and grasp the lecture's content and who paid attention, understand it, and those who don't. Because the conventional wisdom is that the term sex refers to the biological differences between males and females, and gender refers to the culturally constructed roles and behaviors and activities and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. This is not what Butler says. So if I see students parroting that very conventional wisdom that sex is biological and gender is cultural, that's a telltale sign that they haven't engaged with the reading or lecture to the point of having a more theoretically sophisticated understanding of Butler's different formulation and proposition regarding these terms of sex and gender. So this is another binary here, right at the top of the slide, sex and gender. That's another binary opposition, just like nature and culture. You can almost replace them as sex is tantamount to nature and gender is tantamount to culture. But Butler argues that sex is just as socially constructed and culturally contingent as gender. And again, she does this by digging into the genealogy behind the term sex and how it's been constructed over time to appear as a natural fact of life. So she digs into the history of the social construction of sex by inquiring into how this term came to be and how is sex determined? How is that measured? Is it measured by your hormones? Do your hormone levels determine your sex? Like you have a certain amount of testosterone or you have a certain amount of estrogen, therefore you are the male sex or the female sex. Or is it measured and determined by your chromosomes? Like if you have an X and an X chromosome, if you have an X and a Y chromosome, you're this male sex or you're a female sex. Is it your anatomy? If you have this reproductive organ or that reproductive organ, are you by definition then this male sex or female sex? And keep in mind that all these approaches and methods and tools that are developed for measuring and determining natural sex are all human made. So aren't the resulting determinations that those methods and tools produce just as human made? Just as socially constructed? So sex is by no means natural. Sex is just as culturally constructed as is gender. There's a whole deliberately constructed history behind the propping up of sex as this natural fact of life. Just like gender, the term sex and its determinations of such and the ideas surrounding it and the method for determining it have made themselves appear natural over time. But the apparently natural facts of sex are discursively produced by various scientific discourses claiming to have the authority to discover the true nature of one's sex while being and working in the service of political and social interests. And think about how insidious the practical effects of this naturalization of sex can be for transsexual people who are made to appear and feel unnatural just because they don't anatomically or chromosomally or hormonally fit into that socially constructed standard and norm for a certain sex. So sex is not only just as culturally constructed as gender, perhaps it was always already gender. Perhaps there's no real distinction at all between sex and gender. Perhaps sex is just the naturalization of gender and the norms and roles that are imposed upon it. It seems like a very good constructed straw man where people who want to enforce gender roles can say, okay, I acknowledge that gender is culturally constructed, but what about sex? That's completely natural. That's indisputable. You can't argue against sex. But maybe the term sex was literally just set up that way in discourse to serve as a straw man or the fall guy or distraction that people can point to naturalize gender. So gender is not to culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive / cultural means by which sexed nature or a natural sex is produced and established as pre-discursive, as being prior to culture, as existing naturally, and then culture just came along and then just put the label of gender over it as the cultural version of sex. As if sex is just a politically neutral surface on which culture acts and gender is constructed, but sex and gender are both cultural constructions. Neither of them are politically neutral. And because they're strategically placed into this binary of sex is natural and gender is cultural, then we assume that they must be in opposition to each other, that one must be natural and one must be cultural. But really, there's no opposition. There's no distinction. They're the same thing. Sex is gender. So sex is made to appear as the biological determinant of gender, as if sex just exists in biology and provides this unquestionable justification for the notions of gender that culture then comes along and labels the natural fact of sex. But sex is part and parcel of culture. It isn't named and given that natural meaning until culture comes along and gives it that and constructs it just as much as it constructs gender. Sex did not exist prior to or outside of culture. Sex is a creature of discourse. It's a product of discourse. Sex and gender are equally constructed within discourse. So the binary relation and opposition between sex and gender is the cultural and discursive mechanism by which they mutually reinforce each other and provide justification for each other, with one serving as a biological fact that then justifies the gender norms that are associated with it, and the other one serves as the clearly conventionally accepted cultural construction, which then serves to justify the other one as natural. Because like I said, in binary oppositions, we assume that they must be opposed in some way. We assume that if gender is culture, then therefore ipso facto, sex must be natural. And the two work in conjunction and in unison in that self-perpetuating cycle of knowledge and power and truth. So hopefully Butler's point here resonates with many of you. It rings true and it hits home. Because for me personally, it's the most interesting part of this reading. I love these two quotes from page 9. I really think Butler is hitting on an important insight. And I, for one, went my whole life up to the point of doing this reading a few years ago, thinking it was the truth that sex is natural and biological. But then the way she goes about outlining and questioning, well, which one is it then? Is it anatomical? Is it hormonal or chromosomal? It made me realize, like, wow, those are all human-made methods for determining sex. And they're all different too. If sex were universally true and universally natural, there wouldn't be these multiple competing and often contradictory metrics for determining it. So this point is crucial for understanding Butler's framework, and it can take a while to rewire your conceptions and wrap our heads around this profoundly significant insight provided by and through Butler's theoretical framework. And then finally, we come to Butler's idea of gender performativity, her idea that our gender identities are performed by us and through us. It's not an essence that we inherently possess. It's an active performance and a constantly ongoing performance, a continuously ongoing negotiation between us as social agents with certain capabilities for self-expression and the social structures and the social constructs that surround us as agents in our everyday lives. It's a constant tension between structure and agency that jointly produces the performance of our gender identity at any given moment, so that we not only can perform our identities, we can transform our gender identities. Because if we conceive of something as just this fixed essence, this unchangeable fact about ourselves, then we relinquish our own agency. We give it all up to these social constructs that determine that for us. But by exercising our own agency in concert, in negotiation, in dialogue with the structures around us, we can assert who we are vis-a-vis these structures, in relation to these structures, and transform who we are gender identity wise by actively constructing our identities and struggling against the identities that are constructed for us. We can reconstruct them, and by changing ourselves, we can change the structures around us to then correspondingly produce and proliferate new subject positions for us to occupy as social agents. And Butler alludes to this by saying, and I quote, "Gender is a complexity whose totality is permanently deferred. It's never closed off. It's always open, and it's never fully what it is at any given juncture in time." It's kind of like what I referred to with de Beauvoir in terms of constantly reaching beyond yourself, beyond the identity that's given to you at any given moment. The meanings associated with your gender are contestable. They're not fixed and unchangeable. Again, that would be like just a structuralist notion of language as like this closed, fixed structure. Whereas, Butler, of course, is post-structuralist in her ideas that language and its associations of gender and identity is a permanently open and permanently available site of contested meanings. It is perpetually incomplete, and up to us to perform in potentially new ways to ensure that it never gets closed off. So Butler embraces the perpetual unsettled nature of language and discourse because it gives us as social agents operating within discourse to change discourse and the meanings it associates with gender and identity, to allow for new experiences to have meaning, and for new identities and ways of conceiving ourselves as others as possessing veritable meaning and possessing veritable power within social discourse. Of course, it isn't easy and it involves collective struggle, but like Foucault says, freedom lies in the struggle. Once again, alluding to de Beauvoir's tension between happiness and liberty. It's not easy to perform yourself in ways that have never been performed before, or at least like registered in discourse. But by doing so, by challenging the existing discourse, you can open it up to new performances and meanings and subject positions to exist, and challenge and destabilize those binary oppositions that govern our experiences and lives, and think in non-binary ways and identify ourselves in non-binary ways and perform in ways that don't adhere to that strict, rigid binary.